Hi and welcome to Mrs. Long's video lesson on Cecil Day Lewis's poem A Hard Frost. So if you're a South African student, you may not be all that familiar with the context, with the idea of frost, but frost is condensation or water that freezes overnight and looks kind of like everything's covered in a thin layer of pretty sparkly ice. So our poet Cecil Day Lewis is Irish. He's lectured and was awarded the very prestigious title of Poet Laureate. So, yeah, quite a well-known poet, particularly in the UK. So this is the poem. Let's look at the title a bit before we look at the actual text of the poem. So I already explained to you what frost is, but the description of a hard frost just means that it's a frost that lasts for more than a few hours. So as you can imagine, if the condensation freezes on plants and grass and things like that overnight, as soon as the sun comes out, it will start to melt. Now, a hard frost is just a little bit more set in, it will take longer to melt. Okay. A frost came in the night and stole my world, and left this changeling for it, a precocious image of spring, too brilliant to be true. White lilac on the window pane, each grass blade furred like a catkin, Maydrift loading the hedge. The elms behind the house are elms no longer, but blossomers in crystal, stems of the mist that hangs yet in the valley below, amorphous as the blind tissue whence creation formed. The sun looks out and the fields blaze with diamonds. Mockery spring, to lend this bridal gear for a few hours to a raw country maid, then to leave her all disconsolate with old fairings of aconite and snowdrop. No, not here, amid this flounce and filigree of death, is the real transformation scene in progress, but deep, below where frost, warring the stiff clods, unclenches their grip on the seeds and lets the future breathe. Okay. So you'll notice that the poem is structured into two stanzas of similar length. There's no specific rhyme scheme. And the content kind of goes with the stanza structure. So the first stanza is a description of the scene, and the second stanza is more of an exploration of what the scene symbolizes. So as we go through the poem, you'll come across these themes being presented quite strongly, particularly in the first stanza, the idea of the appearance versus the reality. In other words, it appears as if this frost has changed the landscape, but it's actually quite temporary. However, the real change is happening somewhere you can't see it. And then the idea of hardship before growth. In other words, you've got to go through some sort of crucible in order to come out on the other side and experience new growth. And that links to the final lines of the poem. So we're going to take a closer analysis of each line. So if we look at the first few lines of the poem, there's a clear description of this idea that the speaker has woken up and overnight the world has been covered in frost. And there's this lovely image of the frost being personified as a thief who's stolen the world, okay, and left this changeling for it. So a changeling comes from the story or a legend where children or infants are stolen by fairies who then replace the human child with a fairy child who's exactly the same, who looks the same but isn't the same. So a changeling it appears on the surface to be the same thing, but it's actually not. And of course, then the fairies taking human children ties in with the idea of a thief. And so what is left in place of his world is what he describes as a precocious image of spring. So we've definitely got the idea that this is not a genuine portrayal. This is not a genuine thing that he is seeing, because it's an image of spring. It's too brilliant to be true. The speaker can't believe it. There's definitely a tone of skepticism or disapproval because it's too early. It's precocious. It's too early for spring to happen. So the frost has given the appearance of the beauty of spring, because if you can imagine, you'll see on the images here at the bottom that you've got these little crystals, like diamond-like crystals, that covers everything and makes it look really beautiful. And obviously when we think of spring, we think of new growth and flowers. And that's why it's so clever that he uses a description of flowers to describe the different elements of this frost, which ties in with the idea of it kind of being a counterfeit version of spring. So the frost on the window pane is being compared to white lilacs. So you'll see the shape there of those white lilacs, and you can imagine how frost on a window spreads out in almost like snowflake type patterns. And each grass blade is furred like a catkin. So that's a lovely simile. And you'll see there a picture of these little catkins to show you the idea that because the grass is covered in frost, they look like they've got a thin layer of fur on them. It's quite beautiful. Maydrift, again, that's this flower here, is described as loading the hedge. So the hedge is heavy with frost, almost like it has snowed, and it looks like it's covered in this thick layer of these flowers. So even though the frost is cold and icy, it's transformed everything to look so beautiful, as if it would perhaps be the beauty of spring and flowers. The trees, elms are large trees behind the house, are elms no longer. Okay, so no longer, again reminding us that everything looks different, or everything has changed. But instead of elms, they are now blossomers in crystal, stems of the mist. So it's almost as if they are growing, the trees are growing out of this mist, and they're flowers. They're blooming crystal flowers. And again, if you cast your mind to the idea of trees being covered in frost, and you have a look at the images here, you could imagine how that metaphor plays out. Okay, and then you've got the idea of this beautiful mist that hangs in the valley, and it's amorphous, which means it's kind of wispy. It doesn't have a specific solid form, and it's also there being compared to the blind tissue whence creation formed. So in other words, it's this substance that every life form on earth sort of arose from, this primordial soup. Before, if you think of the creation story, or even the idea of the Big Bang, there was this sort of unidentifiable substance, and then all of a sudden everything was created. This, I think, reminds us as well of the possibility of growth that is going to now become more and more apparent in our interpretation of the poem. So in the second stanza, the speaker begins to describe the implications of this sort of temporary counterfeit state of spring. And so even though it's pretty and it looks beautiful, it can't be trusted. And so the lovely use there of the word mockery spring. Now, mockery is not doesn't have positive connotations. So if you think back to the first line, it talks about a thief. So the speaker has a sort of a negative tone, a negative opinion of this frost, which is appearing one way, but actually doesn't have the beauty, is only skin deep, as it were. So the sun is personified as looking out, and as the sun gazes out, the fields blaze with diamonds. Now, I've got that beautiful image there of diamonds, obviously describing how the sunlight would catch the frost. And then the main metaphor in this stanza is this image of the spring, like lending the landscape its beauty for a few hours, as if you would give a poor country girl who isn't used to wearing beautiful things, give her a beautiful wedding dress, but then take it away. And because she's now experienced this beauty, her own poor situation becomes even more starkly apparent to her. So mockery spring lends this bridal gear only for a few hours to a raw country maid, then to leave her all disconsolate with old fairings of aconite and snowdrop. And that's referring to then what the flowers that would be left when the frost melts. They, just all your ordinary everyday flowers that don't have this beautiful frosted covering. So the frost then is sort of compared to a person who is a trickster or a somebody who doesn't live up to their promises. So it gives you something only just to take it away just as you start to enjoy it. Now the final few lines, I suppose, give us an idea of hope, because right, the frost isn't there to signify the coming of spring. It's just a temporary thing that happens that beautifies the cold, hard, wintry landscape for a few hours. But it's not without hope, okay? Because the commentary now from the speaker is not here amid this flounce and filigree of death. And you'll notice there for the first time we've got a sound device in the poem. Now the repeated F word almost highlights the negative, tricking, sort of maybe frustrated tone of the speaker. So the outward manifestation, the filigree, is a very fine, beautiful metalwork. And flounce is, something's all the decorative flourishes. So it's not amid this fake beauty that the real transformation is happening. So now we've got the word real, which contrasts to image, mockery, the changeling, but actually deep below. So not here on the surface where the frost appears to be making a difference. It's actually deep below, because what's happening is the frost is worrying the stiff clods. So as the frost melts, the cold ground would have cracked from the frost, and then the water and air would be able to seep deeper into the ground. And as the stiff clods, in other words, the hard earth, unclenches its grip on the seed, then the real change can take place and the future can breathe. So luckily, a poem that started on rather a negative note ends off with a more hopeful tone, that yes, the frost came briefly. It perhaps fooled the speaker into thinking that spring was there, but it doesn't matter that the frost is only temporary, because it is a sign that spring is coming. It's just not coming right now. It's just not, it's not going to happen immediately. But so on the surface, there doesn't seem to be anything changing, okay, the appearance, but the reality is that deep below, change is taking place. Right, so I hope that helped you understand the poem a little bit more effectively. Feel free to look back and pause on the different images to add to your annotations and notes on the poem. See you next time.